The development of Christianity. The objectives for this are: 1. Describe the public preaching of Jesus, a Jew from Palestine, and 2, summarize how Christianity spread throughout the empire and eventually became the state religion of Rome. Now, last we left off the Roman context, we saw the cultural networking of the Greeks and the Romans as various developments occurred and spread throughout the known world. But here we left one major cultural factor aside, and that was religion. Now, religion, for the Roman context, was much like the Greek. The Romans had been exposed to Greek religion very early on and had, in a certain sense, adopted, though concepts at least, if not the gods themselves, in a Roman kind of context, but with Roman names. The official state religion focused on worship of a number of gods and goddesses, just like we saw in Greece. Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, whom have their parallels, Jupiter to Zeus or Mars to Ares. And so these are parallels to the Greek context. Now, observation of proper ritual by state priests brought them into a right relationship with the gods. Remember what was said about the Greeks. Remember that the Greek religious kind of context was not necessarily a theological thing, a doctrinal thing on how to properly believe or think about the gods, nor was it necessarily a morality kind of issue. Though morality is there, it wasn't about being a good person per se. It was about doing the proper rituals, which of course meant that you were a good person in a certain sense, doing the moral, the right thing, being pious, and of course there was a certain sense of proper theology or correct belief, but that was translated through ritual. That is, do you know how to honor Jupiter? Do you know how to offer the proper ritual or sacrifice to Mars? So this was the context in which the Romans thought about religion, which is going to be completely contrary to the Judeo and inevitably Christian concept. Now, what it resulted through the concept of proper ritual was the Pax Deorum, that is, the peace of the gods. It was believed that the Romans, if they offered the proper rituals and the proper kind of veneration of the gods, that the gods would bring peace upon them, that they would, of course, rule by victory in military matters, because, of course, their gods were more powerful than other gods, at least as so they believed. Now, the Romans were fairly tolerant of other religions, of course, as well. They allowed the worship of various native gods and goddesses anywhere they went. But the concept was, being that they were polytheists, that anywhere they went, they would allow the indigenous peoples to continue to worship their gods, and in fact, the Romans wanted to worship those gods too. Why? Because they didn't deny that they were gods. They certainly didn't deny that the Syrian gods were true Syrian gods. They didn't deny that the Gallic gods were true gods. They believed that these gods were perhaps less powerful than the Roman gods, hence why the Romans were able to conquer them in the first place. But nevertheless, it didn't mean that they didn't have power, particularly in their own regions. And so the idea was then that if these gods continue to be worshipped and venerated, then they won't strike out against us, that they won't be angry with us and lead to some kind of victory. Now, this becomes problematic because no other religion in the region was at all similar to the Judaic religion. By 6 CE, the region of Judea had been made a Roman province and had been placed under the direct rule of Roman officials that were known as procurators. And this procurator was in charge of making sure that the province was in line with the Roman political and religious structure and the Roman and political and religious kind of context that had been set in place all over the world. Now, here's the issue. The Jewish people, being that they were monotheistic, they believed in one God, they told the Roman people, hey, you can't worship our God like you did with the other ones. And in fact, we don't want you to worship him either. You need to let us worship him, and we won't rebel. We'll just, worship him and as he needs to be worshipped. And so they struck a kind of peaceable exception for the Jews, though they were considered strange because they only believed in one God. They read the ancient myths and ancient stories about a powerful God that had rescued them out of Egypt and had done all these miraculous things in antiquity, and so they didn't want to upset an ancient God that might strike out against them. Now, there were various religious and political divisions among the Jews at the time. The first is the Sadducees, which sought cooperation with Rome. They focused on a political and sort of earth-focused interpretation of things as they sought to kind of operate within the way things are. However, the Pharisees, which were another group, protected Jewish identity from Roman influence through close observation of the law. They were focused on sort of the more ethereal element, and of course didn't want to cooperate with Rome because that they wanted to focus on a sort of true and moral segregation in the ancient tradition. Now, they weren't outright rebellious against the Romans. That wasn't the issue. They were interested in a sort of moral segregation or rebellion. But this was, of course, not problematic for the Romans as long as they paid their taxes and were peaceable. However, the last group, among the various others, we'll return to the Essenes in a minute, were the Zealots. The Zealots were a violent group that attempted to overthrow Roman rule. They wanted true political independence. Now, there were another group that were similar to the Pharisees in some sense. They were seeking a true moral superiority, the Essenes, which lived apart from society through sharing goods in common. They were a sort of monastic group that kind of lived off, segregated by themselves. This wasn't problematic, but it was also a small group of people. But the true distinction, and really the ones who ended up causing problems, were these Zealots, who truly wanted a real political independence from Roman rule, which inevitably led to a massive rebellion against Rome and led to Rome's reaction of conquest of the region and inevitably the sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And this was in 70 CE. Here you see on this relief, on the side of Trajan's arch, the triumphal procession of the treasures and spoils of this conflict. And you can see the menorah there depicted that came from the temple. So inevitably the Zealots, seeking true political independence from Rome, saw all that was there destroyed in front of them. Now, in this context, we see the rise of Christianity. Now, the rise of Christianity all circulates around the figure of Jesus. Now, let me give a warning here and a clarification. I am going to speak about Jesus in a historical context. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's different than the religious context, but here we're interested in the historical Jesus, not necessarily the religious aspect that might crop up in various Christian traditions through time. So here we want to look at what Jesus taught. Jesus taught that what was important was not strict adherence to the letter of the law, but the transformation of the inner person. He wasn't there to make people better law followers. He argued for the transformation from the inside out of a person. I mean, this is a major theme that Jesus continually referred to in the various Gospels, particularly the Synoptic Gospels. And Jesus voiced the ethical concepts that kind of dominated the Western value system later on. Humility, charity, love. These still kind of dominate the ideals that exist within Western society. Now, he, of course, stirred up controversy and among Jews and even among the Romans, inevitably. But we see this, of course, because he's ultimately crucified. He's condemned by Pontius Pilate, or at least confirmed of his condemnation by Pontius Pilate by rabble-rousing Pharisees, at least according to the gospel texts. And his followers claimed inevitably that after he had died, he had risen from the dead. At least this is the argument of the Gospels. Now, we see the spread of Christianity following this. And there are two major figures that this is surrounded by. Now, first, Christianity began as a movement within Judaism. This is largely seen around the figure of Simon Peter, arguably one of the key followers of Jesus, a Jewish fisherman whom followed Jesus and whom Jesus said, "You are Peter, upon you, the rock, I will build my church." Now, here's the issue. He is, at least at the time, probably illiterate, certainly not trained in any true religious sense other than his following of Jesus. Now, he is equipped to some extent to speak to his own Jewish people, and this is why it remains in his hands largely a Jewish movement. It really isn't until the conversion of Saul, whom goes by the name Paul, who is an educated Jewish Roman citizen who joined the movement later on. He claimed that he had seen a vision, and while he was a persecutor of early Christianity, he saw a vision of Jesus in which he is transformed, and when he changes his name from Saul to Paul. What's important here is, though, that he has Roman citizenship, he is a Pharisee, but he is also Greek educated. So he is literate in Latin, of course, in Greek, in Hebrew. So he is a sort of go-between between the Jewish sort of segment of Christianity, or followers of Christ, and what will come to the Greeks. Paul believed that he was being sent to the Greeks and to the Roman world to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so he founded communities of followers of Jesus throughout Asia Minor and along the shores of the Aegean Sea, setting up various churches, communities along the way. And of course, these end up taking, or at least being interpreted as, very Greek-minded approaches to a traditional Jewish concept of the universe and of religion and reality. Now, he taught that Jesus' death made up for the sins of all humanity. And this is a key concept here, that he argues that Jesus took on the sins of all humans that ever kind of existed, and that then when we talk to other people, their failures in life, or morals, that the moral failings that have existed have been expunged by Jesus Christ. Now, what's interesting here is that we see a significant change in the context of religion. I mean, the traditional Roman Greek kind of concept was on ritual, right? It wasn't necessarily on morality or doctrine, but that's really what Paul and the Jewish context is really emphasizing. Now, later followers, particularly the followers of Paul, preserved the sayings of Christ and created the Gospels, that is, good news, around these things. Now, of course, many historians argue about when these things were written and at what dates and by whom. Later letters, histories, and gospels were collected to form the New Testament. What's clear is that Paul's writings largely are Paul's. There's no question. The gospels, at least the ones we are aware of, Mark, for example, of course, and that was the earliest, next to the questionable Q source, which we can discuss in class or you can look up for yourself, are the earliest writings. Then Mark and Luke are written after those. These are called the Synoptic Gospels, and which are written largely from the wake of Paul's followers. So Paul's immediate followers write these things down. In fact, Luke seems to have been written for Paul's trial in Rome. But these are interesting issues that we can't really get into in a survey history class, but certainly very interesting and important for the trajectory of Christianity in the Western civilization. Now, Romans, of course, did not react very well to the concepts that the Christians are talking about. I mean, same thing with the Jews. I mean, they're largely foreign. Romans at first paid little attention to Christians. I mean, early on, they just believed they were part of the Jewish sect that had a free pass on doing their own thing. But the Romans tolerated the religions of other peoples unless these religions threatened the public order. And Christianity soon began to be seen as a cult that harmed the good of the Roman state. So Christians were seen as harmful to the Roman state because Christians refused to worship the state gods and the emperor. They were required to pay oaths of loyalty to the emperor, which had a very religious connotation. Particularly by the time you get to the later emperors, they can fancy themselves gods. And so, of course, the Christians want nothing to do with this. Well, when one doesn't do this, Christians are deemed as terrorists in a certain sense, and certainly being guilty of acts of treason. That is, ones who do not abide by the good of the Roman society. Now, on the note of terrorism, in some sense, the idea that Nero at least accuses the Christians of burning Rome to the ground is a serious attack on the city itself and the city proper. And so, of course, Nero can think of no other better solution than to burn then the Christians themselves for burning the city. So you have some very harsh penalties, though in some sense maybe just if it were true. And so it's questionable. Here you can certainly see at least a early depiction of a Christian being killed by non-Christians. Here they're sawing him in half, and he looks as if he's surrendering or praying or looking up to God for peace through what might seem a pretty horrible experience. But the Roman government began persecuting Christians during the reign of Nero, and this was, of course, in response to this treason and rebellion and outright destruction of Roman infrastructure and society. Now, of course, this resulted in probably the most common means by which Christians were killed, that is, through gladiatorial events and games. We can see here in this mosaic, these are Christians, or at least people, slaves, or some criminals being mauled to death by wild animals. This was, of course, common. This was a form of entertainment. And all people that were guilty of treason were executed in similar manners for often the spectacle of all others. Now, inevitably, however, Christianity is triumphant. The Romans persecuted Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries, but by the time we hit the 3rd century and into the 4th century, the 300s, Christianity soon comes to dominate. Now, Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries became more organized. We see the emergence of a true clergy, that is, true pastors, in a sense, or priests, and a laity, people who were not part of that religious leading, but had organized themselves in such a way that they were effective in building churches and making converts. Now, Christianity proved attractive to all classes, but especially the poor and powerless, because of the kind of message that is characterized within Jesus' teachings. When it says all are equal in the kingdom of God, and when it says that all people are forgiven, not just the wealthy and elite, this is, of course, encouraging, especially for those who don't have a lot to lose. And so it stressed a sense of spiritual equality of all people, and this is, of course, a good news, a gospel for the slave and for the poor and for women, which is largely the largest group that is attracted to Christianity early on. Now, new persecutions emerged under Diocletian and under similar rulership in Rome, largely as a reaction to the political tumultuous time and the barbarian invasions that we'll discuss later. And so these rebellions were seen as part and parcel to the overall decline of Rome. Now, Christianity ultimately, however, prospered under one of the subsequent emperors, Constantine. Now, Constantine, so the story goes, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, was inspired by some vision in which he saw in the sky a Chi-Rho, the P intersected by the X in the English alphabet, which is actually the first two letters of the abbreviation of Christ, or in some historical traditions and accounts, it's a cross. But either case, he sees this symbol in the sky, and he's told, "And hoc signo vinces," that is, in this sign, conquer. And so he had his soldiers paint this symbol on their shields, and were ultimately victorious in battle, and secured him the rulership of the Roman Empire, ultimately, inevitably, seizing total control, which led him, at least according to tradition, the passing of the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which made it legal for people to be Christians. This was not the state sponsorship of Christianity per se, but it certainly was the allowance of various people, including other cults, to allow their existence in the Roman Empire. It wasn't until much later, under Theodosius the Great, that Christianity was officially adopted as the religion of the Roman Empire. Now, at this time, of course, one had to be Christian to get into upper politics, and so this led to a massive flooding of Christian converts, whether true or just politically expedient. Whatever the case might be, within a few short centuries, Christianity comes to dominate the Western Roman world. Now, the objectives were, 1, describe the public preaching of Jesus, a Jew from Palestine, and 2, summarize how Christianity spread throughout the empire and eventually became the state religion of Rome.